You're listening to Glove Up or Shut Up on the Angry Marks Podcast Network.
My name is Peter H. I'm joined once again by my co-host from Omaha, Nebraska, Stevie J.
Hey, Peter. It's been a very eventful weekend. Very unfortunate set of circumstances that just happened on Monday that we'll be talking about to open the show, but a very newsworthy last few days. And as a result, we have a very special guest to join us to talk about all the things that have happened in the world of MMA this week. He is a senior MMA analyst for Bleacher Report, a contributor to the Washington Post, and a co-host of the Heavy Hands podcast, among many other things, and a good friend of mine from the Sure Dog Radio Roundtable, Patrick Wyman. Good evening.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure chatting with you guys.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again, and I wish the circumstances were better, but first and foremost, Patrick, I'll let you lead off with the news about Kimbo Slice.
Oh, man. What a gut punch, you know? Like, Kimbo was never the greatest fighter on practically any show that he ever fought on, but he was refreshingly upfront about what he was there to do. And more than anything, what Kimbo had was the rarest gift of all in combat sports. I mean, he had, first of all, charisma, but he had the gift for making people care about his fights. And that is a rare commodity in combat sports. The ability to get people invested in you, that's not something that comes along very often. It's part of what made him special. In addition to the fact that just by every account, he was a genuinely good guy, a genuinely nice person. Like, nobody has had a bad word to say about him. And hasn't for years. Everybody who has ever interviewed him, talked to him, trained with him, seemed to have positive things to say about him.
Yeah, I can echo those sentiments because I've been to shows live where he's fought, and he's always been charming and affable anytime I've run into him at any of those shows, and always answered any question that was asked to him. And like you said already, he had that very charismatic personality that just drew people to him, whatever he chose to do in life. And nobody ever said or implied that he was the greatest MMA fighter of all time, and certainly by his own admission, he was just a man from the streets who was trying to make his way and make a living, and he would admit he wasn't the greatest of all time, but in not being the greatest, he did have one of the greatest gifts, that gift of the it factor, just making people, as you said, making people care about him, and that's why we're so distraught right now by this turn of events. And Peter, I'll let you discuss the wherefores and hows of what happened.
I mean, this is still a fluid situation as far as details are coming out, but the latest news that I saw, it has to do with the issue that he needed a heart transplant and his heart failed. So that's the latest I've heard, Stevie, unless you know more than I do.
No, that's the same that I'm aware of, and obviously things went downhill really quickly on Monday night because I got an email from my editor at MMA Mania asking me, write this up, he's in a hospital in Florida, things don't look good. And before I could even finish writing that article, American Top Team was already tweeting that he passed away. So if he was told he needed a heart transplant, it must have been very, very urgent, and he couldn't even hang on long enough for that to even be a possibility. He just went too fast, too quick. And I think the quickness of it is what's shocking to people, because Dada 5000, his last opponent, was in the hospital for, 2 weeks, just fighting to live, and yet Kimbo died in a matter of hours. And that's what I think is really boggling people right now. And I'll go back to Patrick on that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that between Dada and Kimbo was the one who died, despite the fact that Dada spent all that time in the hospital and, by his account, actually died there. That's totally insane. It's totally insane that this happened as fast as it did. It's totally insane that Kimbo and Dada were fighting in a cage 4 months ago. That's nuts. And it raises some really serious questions, I think, or at least it should, about the things that Bellator is doing right now in terms of the kind of talent that they're bringing in. And, and also with the Texas Athletic Commission, should there have been things here that they caught? How is it possible that a guy could need a heart transplant and 4 months before that he was medically cleared to fight by a promotion and a state regulatory agency? Shouldn't this have been something that somebody picked up on? I don't have the answers to those questions, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but it seems like somebody probably should have caught something at some point here.
And I think you almost alluded to it, but if not, you can tell me that that wasn't what you meant. But you mentioned that he was cleared when he competed at that show, and then after the show, he failed a drug test. And kind of excused it when he was interviewed about it afterwards, saying that, you know, we're a little older fighters should take a few vitamins. Well, that has to come under some scrutiny now that he's passed away.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the science on anabolic steroids and heart conditions is pretty well established at this point. So, like, it's hard not to see that. And that probably wasn't the first time, that Kimbo had perhaps taken some extra vitamins. I'm sure that's a contributing factor, but like, this is, you don't want to go too deep into stuff like that. None of that should take away from who Kimbo was and what he meant to so many people. Like, he was a good-hearted guy doing something that he loved doing, for an audience of people that cared to watch for him. And all the questions about his death, we're going to learn a lot more about that. I have a feeling in the next, in the next weeks and months.
I agree. And more than anything else, the human tragedy of this needs to be at the forefront, because 6 kids now don't have a father, and his fiance no longer has a boyfriend looking at future husband. That never even got to happen. It's a tragedy for all of them as well. I guess I don't know what to say other than that. There's no easy way to segue out of that. It's just...
I mean, I look at his career, I see like a journeyman fighter. He fought in all the big promotions and even has a victory over Ken Shamrock.
Well, that's the
Like,
fight
how
I was
many
at
fighters can say that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about him being a draw. He drew me to St. Louis because of the spectacle of Bellator 138. Ken Shamrock, Kimbo Slice. I had to be there. I had to credential. I had to see it firsthand in person. Just watching it on TV wasn't going to be good enough for me, so I made that trip. And that just shows you the kind of draw Kimbo was. Say he's the greatest fighter of all time? No, but say he's a draw? Absolutely. And it's... I just don't even know what else to say at this point other than my heart goes out to his family and all his friends, because they're without Kimbo Slice in their life. Kevin Ferguson, Kimbo was just his street name, his fighting name, but Kevin was the man behind that identity, and Kevin's gone now, so we'll learn more in the weeks to come. But in the meantime, we did have a very newsworthy UFC 199. Perhaps, I don't know, I'd go ahead and call it the greatest UFC card of the year. What do you guys think, Patrick?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It had everything. I was there live. I was there as a fan. I didn't have to work at the event. Had a ton of fun. The main event was utterly insane. The whole card was insane. Like, Lombard Henderson was nuts. Holloway Lamas was crazy. Poirier Green was nuts. Ortega Guida was fun. Vic Dariush was fun. Everything about this card was great. Like, the sheer joy that Dominic Cruz took in embarrassing Uriah Faber came through very clearly. If it came through clearly on TV, but it was pretty obvious to those of us watching in the crowd just how much fun he was having doing all of that. Like, it was a crazy event, but, overshadowed by, unfortunately, one of the biggest upsets in UFC title fight history, overshadowed by the ancillary things that happened with them kicking out Ariel Helwani, kicking out, I think even more importantly, kicking out Esther Lynn and Casey, literally some of the best people in MMA. So,
well, thankfully, I want to interject. Sorry if I'm interrupting, but they did get that situation resolved in the last 24 hours. Everybody's back in the graces again. I don't know if that's going to last long term, but short term at least, that issue seems to have blown over. Yeah,
short term, but the deeper issues that speaks to certainly haven't. And there's, at the end of the day, like, yeah, Ariel has his credentials back and Esther and Casey are going to be back running shows, but that's a pretty revealing incident that speaks to how the UFC understands media and how it understands the flow of information. And like, this only gotten weirder since it happened. Like, with what Helwani had to say on the MMA Hour yesterday, and Joe Rogan's comments about the UFC claiming that there was a mole who was feeding Ariel information, which speaks to a real lack of understanding of how the flow of information to journalists works in the first place. Like, the story keeps getting weirder and stranger, despite the fact that the outcome has been settled at this point.
Right. Well, I want to focus more on the UFC card itself for the moment, and maybe we can touch back on this before you go, but it just feels like this issue has been pounded to death in the last day or two, with him doing the public mea culpa on the MMA Hour and then the credentials being restored. So I'll circle back to that in a minute, but I want to talk about this card because, as you said, it overshadowed some of the spectacular fights that we saw that night. And let's start with Michael Bisping achieving his dream, 10-1 underdog. Nobody saw it coming. I sure didn't pick it. If I'd been on a Sherdog table for this one, I wouldn't have picked it. I didn't in my Wrestling Observer picks. So if you picked it, Patrick, my hat's off to you. I didn't check to see what your pick was.
Oh, no, I absolutely did not pick that. I thought that was it was totally insane. It was the culmination of Michael Bisping doing everything right and hitting a pretty low probability shot, you know? Like, there's no real way around that. Bisping by first round knockout was not an outcome that anybody picked here. And for good reason, especially considering what we saw 18 months ago when these two fought. Like, Bisping kept it relatively close in the first round, but less than a minute into the second, he got head kicked and then choked with one arm. Like, there was not a whole lot to take from that performance to make you think that Bisping had a shot here. And yet, here we are. It's the middle of next week, and Michael Bisping is still the UFC middleweight champion. So what do you make of that?
I don't even know, but I will confess that if you listened to last week's show, I told Peter that the odds were exactly right. He tried to tell me they were too long, and I said, did you watch their last fight? I'm not saying he has no chance, but he has no chance. So, Peter, you get to gloat a little bit right now.
Well, I mean, I didn't expect first round knockout, but I know the odds did definitely change when Rockhold it was revealed that he had a knee injury going into the fight.
Well, that's the funny thing though, his knee wasn't in any way braced or, wrapped up. It was his foot. I was wondering more what was going on with his foot than his knee. Maybe, Patrick, since you were there live, did you hear anything about that?
I did not hear a dang thing. I mean, you know, a torn MCL, it affects the stability of your knee to some extent, but it's not the world's biggest issue. Like, it's not good. Like, you don't hope to go into a fight with a torn MCL, but it's not the worst case scenario. As far as his foot, though, I mean, with as hard as they spar and train at AKA, he could have gone into that fight with a broken foot. That's entirely possible. But, I have no, information on that.
Well, it's almost as newsworthy that after the fight, and in the post-fight press conference, when Bisping was trying to say, thank you for making me step up my game, thank you for being a great champion, I've realized my dream, it couldn't have happened without you, Luke Rockhold didn't want any part of that. He was being rather surly and testy about the whole thing.
Well, both guys were, you know? That's the crazy thing. It's like, neither one of these guys has any interest, I don't think. Granted, Bisping took a stab at it, but like, the true Bisping returned shortly thereafter. Like, these dudes are gonna have the best lead up to their trilogy fight of any that we've seen in the UFC for a very long time. Whenever they get their rubber match, like, that is gonna be one of the best builds the UFC has had access to in a long time. Because these guys really genuinely don't like each other. Like, how many grudge matches do we see where the guys don't have those feelings to that extent? This is legit. This is genuine. They really dislike each other, and we're gonna get a whole another few months of that at some point.
Yeah, I almost think in hindsight it actually worked out better that Chris Wyman got injured. Not that you want anybody to have a neck injury and be on the shelf for a long time, but wow, the genuine animosity between the two of these made for a whole lot better build than a rematch of Wyman and Rockhold would have.
Yeah, I can't deny that. Like, Bisping, nobody ever thought that Bisping would be in this position. The fact that Bisping manages to generate this much heat from everybody is incredible. It's his biggest gift, far more than anything that he does in the cage. And now, given the fact that he's the champion, he finally has the platform to use it properly. And that's an amazing thing.
Not to mention, this is amazing because, as I said to Peter last week, he was the perennial, always the bridesmaid, never the bride guy of UFC. He was the guy that not only never got the title shot, he couldn't even get past the fight to get the title shot. He'd always come up short in the number one contenders match, and then on 2 weeks' notice, he goes in and shocks the world. He gets to literally live his dream. That is the amazing part of the whole thing.
It's crazy. It's totally nuts. Like, what an unlikely series of events to lead us to this point. Because, like, I was picking Rockhold against Chris Weidman again. Maybe if he'd fought Chris Weidman here, the specific things that he'd been working on for that camp and that fight would have applied better. Maybe he beats Chris Weidman, and then, you know, we would never have known that this was a thing that could have possibly happened. But Bisping was healthy. He was ready. The things that he has been working on over the last year and a half, pretty clearly played out well in this fight. He's a much better counterpuncher now than he was before. He was much more willing to hang in the pocket and exchange with a bigger, stronger, heavier puncher in Rockhold. And, you know, so he was equipped to meet this challenge. He was in the right place at the right time, but he had the tools to make Rockhold pay. The fact that it worked out the way that it did was unexpected, but there were clearly things that Bisping had been working on that helped him here.
Do you put this fight, the trilogy fight, do you make the third one near the end of the year, or dare I say, have the Bisping-Rockhold trilogy fight in England?
I hadn't even thought about that question yet. Right now, they've got so many cards stacked up between 200, 201, and 202 that, honestly, they don't even need it for a while. They really could wait till the end of the year.
Call me crazy on this front, but you want to do that fight next, right? Like, Chris Weidman, all due respect to him, but he's having neck surgery. He's going to be out for a little while. You make the immediate rematch between Bisping and Rockhold, right? Like, that's easily the biggest fight in the division. Jacare is having minor knee surgery. Like, you have to go right back to the Bisping and Rockhold well, don't you? Because there's heat from it. Like, it's a compelling fight. It was a huge upset. Like, it's a fight that could definitely sell now, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just a question of the timing because, like you said, it's the obvious way to go. Everybody else is either hurt or out and not available anyway. But when and where do you do it? And do you do it in England? And I guess you could do it in England, but that makes it really weird to air it on pay-per-view here. That could be a timing problem.
That would be, you could, if they're really committed to building Fight Pass, putting a Luke Rockhold, Michael Bisping title fight on Fight Pass, that could be what you're looking for in terms of building that platform. You'd be giving up conservatively 400,000 pay-per-view buys to do that, but it might be a worthwhile long-term investment in the Fight Pass platform.
And that certainly worked out well for them with the Bisping-Silva fight. They convinced a lot of people who were just hanging on, waiting to see if something was worthwhile, that, hey, you're getting to see Anderson Silva and it's only on Fight Pass. And they got a lot of people to cash in their chips and buy a subscription just to see it.
Yeah, so maybe there's that angle to it, but I don't know. I mean, I hadn't even thought of doing it in England, but that does make sense.
Especially at the O2 Arena. They would probably pack the place and you'd hear the loudest ole, ole, ole chants of all time for Bisping when he came out. That would be a fun way to see that fight. But let's move on to the co-main event. And as you said already, Patrick, Dominic really got to embarrass Uriah in this fight. The only round where Uriah looked good was the first, and after that it was pretty smooth sailing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was, I tweeted this on Saturday night, but it was almost a little bit sad being there in person, watching Faber's kingdom go not with a bang, but with a whimper. That he just offered almost nothing in the last 4 rounds, especially, like, I looked at the fight metric numbers because I was really curious about this. Faber was still throwing in the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th round. He actually upped his output after the 1st and the 2nd round. He was throwing more and landing less. He landed like 6 punches in the 3rd round. I think he landed 8 in the 4th and something comparable to that in the 5th. Like, he was just swinging at air. It was like all of a sudden, like, Faber got old, and it was clear that he was just nowhere close to Cruz's level. And like, the joy that Dominic Cruz took in beating him and beating him badly and then twisting the knife at the press conference afterwards was almost unseemly, but not quite. It was peak MMA. It was perfect MMA.
Well, since you mentioned that, I'll briefly address it before I go to Peter on this. When he acted like he didn't even know who Cody Garbrandt was, and then made fun of Uriah Faber for making money off of all his teammates and saying, nobody in my camp, I don't make money off them. We all work together. Nobody gets paid. Like, ooh, you're really digging in deep here. You're not going to let him off the hook.
Yeah, I mean, that dig was perfect. Because for years, Faber has gotten to control the public perception of him in ways that very few people in MMA have. And, like, that's an absolutely true thing. Not only is Faber making money off of his guys in that sense, Faber also had ties to the management company that was repping most of those guys, and that frankly did a terrible job with them. Like, when Joseph Benavidez got a raise after the Reebok deal started on his gear sponsorships, like, that's totally insane. That's a totally insane thing. But Faber was making money off of that side of things too. And the fact that Cruz had the wherewithal to do that after just having beaten the guy for 5 rounds, the man is an incredible heel. Should he choose to embrace that role? Like Cruz is just perfect for that role.
Yeah, I guess he is kind of a heel in that sense, but I just have so much respect for him after watching him fight at this high of a level for so many years that it's hard for me to view him as the villain, even if he's just totally mocking and destructing people with the heelish things that he says. Peter, you can jump in on this, but I enjoyed it. I was like, yeah, you got the right to say it. You're the champ.
Yeah, I was actually on the show last week talking about how I'd like to see Faber pull off the upset and have that one win in this trilogy, so to speak. But yeah, Cruz just man, Cruz was Cruz. It was like Manny being Manny in baseball. And the end result was the same script we've seen before. And Cruz can basically have that swagger and basically run amok with that division now, as he comes back and he's the champ. Comes back, he's the champ. It's like, what do we got to do to stop him and keep him down and never come back?
Well, Peter, as I said before, and I got to say it again here, he does have one loss on his career, and that one loss is to Uriah Faber, and that's why he's relishing twisting in the knife now, because Faber won the first one, but he hasn't won since then, and that's really the point he's trying to prove here, is like, you beat me once, but 2 out of 3 times, I'm the better man.
Yeah, I agree.
From that, we move on to the other unlikeliest of upsets on the main pay-per-view card. I was very unsure about this one when the fight was announced, and I was uncomfortable with the idea of Dan Henderson. As much as I love him, as much as I respect him, taking a fight after what's happened to him in some of his recent fights at his age, and when he got rocked a couple of times in the first round, I was really, really concerned, but the comeback after that, miraculous is the only word I can think of. Patrick?
I mean, it was incredible. But, like, this was the good Dan Henderson. Like, in the past few years, we've seen occasionally a good Dan Henderson, and much more often a bad Dan Henderson, who kind of lumbers forward, winging an overhand right. This was good Dan Henderson. Despite getting rocked early by Lombard, even though he was getting rocked, he was still the better fighter in the first round overall. Like, he was doing a beautiful job of timing his right hand and letting Lombard come to him. He did a beautiful job of using his kicks to establish the longer distance that he wanted against a shorter fighter. It was a really, really smart performance. And the fact that he finished it the way that he did, with a head kick and then that weird ass elbow that he landed, like, props to him for doing that. But, like, he put himself in the right position to land the shots that he wanted. He, like, using the right low kick to set up the right high kick. Like, that was the best technical performance we've seen from Dan Henderson, probably since he fought Shogun Rua in 2011.
Right.
I agree.
In fact, when people say this should be his retirement fight, that's exactly why. It's the best fight we've seen him have since Shogun Rua. I mean, is he going to go out on a higher note than this? I don't think it's possible to. And it's also hilarious, as you said, people trying to figure out what to say about that elbow. My favorite description of it to this point is bar room elbow. I don't think you can do better than that.
Yeah, it was totally bizarre and strange, but it was perfect. It was somehow the perfect shot to throw and land at that particular moment. And, like, I do hope that Henderson retires, because he can't keep doing this forever. And no matter how sharp he is, even if he comes into every fight as sharp as he was against Lombard, like, his chin is just not there anymore. And it's kind of a miracle that he made it out of that first round against Lombard, despite looking pretty good from a technical perspective. So, I mean, I hope he goes out on this high note, but if he doesn't, he can win fights if he shows up in the kind of form that he was here. If he comes up trying to blast overhand rights, like, he's going to give himself a way, way worse chance.
He can't take as many direct shots that drop him on his butt as he did against Lombard. If he takes those against anybody else and he gets a less generous referee, he's going to be waved off before he gets the chance to show his range and technique.
Yeah, absolutely so. Absolutely so.
All right.
So I would call that, instead of a 12-6, I'd call that elbow a 3-9.
That's another good way of putting it. Why not? So, 2 other fights on the main card. Max Holloway pretty much expected to win and did just that, dominated for all 3 rounds. Patrick, any thoughts on this?
That actually didn't surprise me all that much. I think Holloway is one of the very best defensive wrestlers in a division that has a bunch of really, really good defensive wrestlers. In a division with Jose Aldo and Chad Mendez and guys like, and a whole bunch of dudes who are really hard to take down, Holloway might be the best defensive wrestler of them all. The only guy who is very clearly better than him is, I would say, is Jose Aldo. But he's an insane defensive wrestler, but more than anything, even though he was expected to win this fight, I was shocked by how smart Holloway fought a fight that was risky at points. So the last 10 seconds of exchanging in the middle of the cage was pretty nuts. But before that, that wasn't the only time that Holloway exchanged with him. Every time he backed Lamas up to the cage, he was willing to sit down and exchange in layers with him, to throw at Lamas, let Lamas throw back at Lamas, let Lamas throw at him again, and then throw back once more. But he did so at points where it was safe for him to do it, right? So with Lamas' back to the fence, Holloway has all the room in the world to take small steps and move back and basically establish the pocket as he wants to. And also, Lamas' stance isn't fully under him at those points. So if Lamas lands something, it's probably not going to be the hardest possible shot. So it's a way to make his fights exciting, to land volume, but still do so in a fashion that's relatively safe. Like that's just super. And that to me sums up Holloway as a fighter. He's just so smart with everything that he does. There were some rumors today that Jose Aldo was going to be out of UFC 200, and it looks like those rumors are false. But I just want to see Holloway fight for a title. I think he's earned it. 9 straight wins. Incredible talent. He's earned a shot at the top. Whether that happens or not is not up to him, but I sincerely hope he gets it.
Somebody, I think it might have been Joe Rogan, or maybe it might have been somebody else's show I was listening to, called it the longest application to receive a title shot in UFC history. And if that's the application, I think he's crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. It's there now. Peter, what do you say?
I say make that match, if Aldo is 100% healthy, make it soon after the fight. That happens at UFC 200.
Yeah, the Aldo Edgar fight. That's going to crown our interim champion, and who knows, maybe eventually crown the actual champion if Conor McGregor never gets around to defending his belt again. That still seems to be up in the air whether he's ever going to come back and do that, because he's too obsessed with fighting Nate Diaz at welterweight, and the longer he spends at that weight, the harder it's going to be for him to get back down to 145 again.
Is that rematch confirmed for welterweight though?
Yeah, it's at 170. It's UFC 202, 170 pounds. That's guaranteed. That's the weight and that's the date.
Oh, okay.
We have one other fight on the main card, Poirier and Bobby Green.
This was Green's first fight back in 18 months. I think more than anything, I thought this was about how good Poirier looked. Poirier has just come along by leaps and bounds, especially since he moved up to 155. But he's been steadily getting better for years and years and years. He's got a really unique style that nobody else in the lightweight division can really match. I would say he's the only pure puncher fighting at 155 in the UFC who's competing at that level. As in a guy who has big power but has the technical craft and know how to apply it really well. And Green is a good defensive fighter, but he just could not stand up to the kind of variety and volume that Poirier was showing him in the pocket. And so, the first sequence where Poirier knocks Green down, Green avoids the first 3 shots in this 4-punch combination. The first one comes up short. He slips away from the second one. He blocks the third one with his glove, but it's the 4th shot from Poirier that sneaks around and clips Green on the chin. So, if you're avoiding 75% of the shots from a puncher in the pocket, you're doing pretty good. It's just that the 4th one was the one that Poirier threw that Green missed, that Green couldn't block, couldn't avoid. I think Green did everything he could, but this version of Dustin Poirier is just a freaking monster. And I would favor him over most of the guys that he's going to fight on his way up to the top. But I think he is a title caliber fighter in a division that's full of awesome fighters.
To steal a line from Conor McGregor to describe his performance in this fight, he was efficient with his energy. What do you say, Peter?
I think he's in the conversation for a title shot, but you gotta look at that lineup. And Patrick, you mentioned it, it's a great list of fighters there. So, he's in the conversation, but I'm not sure who you match him up with next.
Well, if you're going strictly by the rankings, he's number 9 right now, so probably a guy like Showtime Anthony Pettis or Michael Johnson, somebody that's a little bit ahead of him, that he's working his way up toward that top 5.
I'd give him Donald Cerrone. If Cerrone wants to come back down to 155, give him Donald Cerrone as the headliner of a Fox Sports 1 card or the second fight on a Fox card, something like that. And make that a top contender matchup for Poirier. Not for Cerrone. Cerrone's not getting back to that point. I think we can all come to terms with it. But that, and I would take Poirier in that matchup. I would pick him over Cerrone in that fight.
I'd like to see that fight, so hopefully it happens. But I'm just going to open this up at this point since our time's starting to run a little low, Patrick. So any fights on the prelims, Fight Pass, FS1 that you want to talk about?
I was really impressed by what Beneil Dariush did to James Vick. Benny, that was the first fight to me where Dariush really looked 100% like a Rafael Cordero trained fighter. And by that, I mean that Dariush was mean. He fought mean. You know what? Does that make sense? Everybody with, Joe Rogan, you listen to him talk about Dariush, he talks about how intelligent he is. He talks about his smart approach to the game. He talks about his grappling. But Dariush came out throwing absolute bombs in that fight. Not in like an untechnical way, but in a way that said he wanted the pressure. He wanted to get in there. He wanted to do damage to James Vick. And we've seen that in flashes from Dariush before, but this was the first time where he really looked like the kind of guy who trains on a regular basis with Dos Anjos, and who trains under a coach who trained Vanderlei Silva and Shogun Rua. Does that make any sense at all?
No, I agree with you. The aggression that he showed, and against a guy who's not unaggressive himself in the Texecutioner, that really did impress me. I felt like, as you've said a couple of times, with guys like Max Holloway and Dustin Poirier, I felt like this was the evolution of a guy who seems to be consistently getting better.
Yeah, he is really smart, and he does work really hard, and he is a great grappler, but I wasn't really sold on him necessarily being competitive with guys at the top of the division. But if he fights with this kind of aggression and that kind of power in his shots that he showed against Vick, I don't know where exactly I slot him or where I think he tops out, but that's a really, really, really dangerous fighter.
Down the road, this actually could be a matchup we see, like him and Dustin Poirier. That could be a fight in the future that we get.
I will watch the hell out of that fight. I would watch the hell out of that.
I want to briefly touch on Jessica Andrade and Jessica Penne. Penne was formerly a top contender, but she just got overwhelmed. Andrade just turned on the gas and wouldn't let up this whole fight.
That was I think that brought back some terrible memories of the kind of flurries that Joanna Jędrzejczyk landed against Penne against the fence. But this is what Andrade has always been capable of. It's just she was always giving up 15, 20 pounds to everybody she was fighting. And she's a rock'em sock'em robot. I love her flurries. I love the way she goes to the head and the body. She just doesn't let up. I think the closest analog for her style is John Lineker. That she's a puncher, and she's not necessarily a pressure fighter, though she does want to be moving forward, but she doesn't miss opportunities to throw and land strikes. That's what I think makes her so similar to Lineker, is they're not necessarily, it's hard to game plan for somebody who just has a knack for always seeing the opening to land shots. And it's never just one shot. It's 2, 3, 4, 10, 12, 15. If you just stand there and let them throw at you, they're not going to stop. And that's kind of a rare gift to have. But it makes Andrade really dangerous now that she's not really risking getting overpowered by fighters like Liz Carmouche.
At one point, I thought maybe Penne's strategy was just let her continue to throw until she gasses out and then turn the tables on her. But the problem was she was getting clipped too much in her attempts to throw up her hands and block those shots. And she, the referee wasn't going to let her stand there and get wailed on all day. So time ran out for that strategy, that rope-a-dope kind of deal to work out for it. It was too much volume in too quick of an amount of time.
It was nasty, man. All I know is I want to see Jessica Andrade in fights with people like Rose Namajunas and Tisha Torres. There are a lot of great matchups for her in that division. It just goes to show how much better and deeper a division strawweight is than bantamweight. There are a ton of great fights to make in that division.
Absolutely. And I think bantamweight got dominated for so long by Ronda Rousey, just destroying one contender after another, that we're kind of doing a whole reset on that right now between Miesha Tate, Holly Holm, and anybody else that's going to fight either of the two of them. It's a whole new ballgame at bantamweight, and while we wait to figure that out, strawweight is definitely where the excitement is in the short term. So kudos to that division, and hey, kudos to the Ultimate Fighter as well for building up a fight that I surely want to see after seeing the way Jędrzejczyk and Gedalia are sniping at each other this whole season. I don't know if it's doing box office at the ratings, but it's fun for me to watch.
Yeah, I can't say as I've watched much of it, but you give me an opportunity to watch Joanna Jędrzejczyk and Claudia Gedalia in a cage, and I will be the first one there.
Amen to that. So, you did mention at the beginning of this conversation that we had a bit of a kerfuffle, a situation that occurred, and to briefly touch on it and not go too deep into it, it seems the crux of the issue was that Ariel broke the story of Brock Lesnar returning before UFC could do it themselves. That's my understanding.
Yeah, that's basically what happened. And the corollary to that is the UFC thinks that there is somebody in their organization who is leaking information to Ariel Helwani. They think they have a mole. And that to me is the most screwed up part of this whole story. In addition to banning a reporter for reporting a fight announcement, which is kind of insane on the face of it. It just speaks to I think the UFC's lack of understanding of how journalism works and their lack of interest in it. And like, you know, the UFC, this is obviously not the first time the UFC has had issues with media, but like the fact that their explanation for how Helwani is getting this information is that they have to have a mole speaks to how little they understand about how that business works. That like, there was not one person or even two people in the UFC who knew that Lesnar was coming back. There were a lot. Helwani has a lot of sources because that's what good journalists do. And like the idea that he was breaking some sort of unwritten rule of conduct there is just totally insane. And, you know, like, however, the fact that this seems to be resolved at this point, it's all well and good, but it's only a matter of time before the UFC's attitude towards the media rears its head again. So we should be ready for it when it does.
I agree. And I think Peter was a little bit nervous about this topic before the show tonight because we discussed it off the air, and he's going to be covering UFC very shortly here, so I think he fears repercussions if he says anything about this topic. So Peter, if you choose to remain mum, I understand.
I'm just looking forward to next Saturday in Ottawa here, and looking forward to a great card.
Well, on that note, why don't we get Patrick's thoughts about the Ottawa card before we have to let him go?
Oh, great fight at the top. Really stoked about Stephen Thompson versus Rory McDonald. Really interested in Donald Cerrone versus Patrick Cote too. That's a great fight. It's not a super deep card, but it's got some interesting fights and some interesting prospects on it. Interested to see how Olivier Aubin-Mercier rebounds from the first loss of his career. A lot of stuff like that. I'll be watching with some interest, but really I'm tuning in for McDonald Thompson. That's the fight that's got my blood up.
Yeah, and actually, ironically enough, that's the fight that sort of created waves for Ariel in the first place because he asked Rory what he was going to do after this fight, and he said, I'm going to test free agency. And I think that was the first shot across the bow where UFC felt like we can't control the flow of information if Rory McDonald goes on his show and says he's going to be a free agent after this fight.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. That's a huge narrative here, and it's one we're going to see playing out more and more and more. But I'm just stoked for the fight itself as much as anything else. Like, that is a fantastic freaking matchup. Like, really, really compelling and really interesting. But, you know, the fact that McDonald has been so vocal about that definitely adds another layer of interest.
But it's amazing that Thompson has just gotten to this point in such a rapid amount of time, just blowing through on his way to this point. You know, it didn't look easy at first. You know, his first few fights on this 6-fight win streak, he was getting a unanimous decision and knockout, and then things really picked up steam with Ellenberger and Hendricks, and now he's to the point where you have to look at him like, if he's not the next guy, if he wins this fight, he should be.
Yeah, it was kind of a slow process at first. Like, you didn't really notice the improvements one by one, and like the loss to Matt Brown, I think took all the wind out of everybody's sails as far as he was concerned. So he had the luxury of improving off of everybody's radar, you know, like, and that's a nice thing for a prospect, and it's something we should bear in mind moving forward. Like, prospects are going to lose. It's going to happen. There are too many variables in the sport of MMA for guys to go undefeated. Like, it's what guys do after that matters as far as their development as fighters. And what we saw after that was him shoring up his wrestling game, mixing in offensive takedowns, becoming a better boxer, becoming a better puncher, figuring out how to better control the space of a cage after not having fought in a cage for all that long. We saw him making all these improvements. It shouldn't have been as shocking as it was that he iced Hendricks the way that he did.
No, I suppose not. And Hendricks, I think, has been affected as much or more by the new rules about rehydration and weight cutting as anybody else, because it doesn't seem like he's able to bulk up as high and cut down and do it effectively, because he either has an issue with missing the weight cut or just not having as much energy and power as he used to.
Yeah, I don't know what the solution is to Johnny Hendricks' woes, but his woes are real. Like, there just seem to be a lot of different things going wrong as far as he's concerned right now. And it's hard to say, like, I don't know what the path back is for him. Like, I'll probably be picking Kelvin Gastelum over him at UFC 200.
I'm feeling that way myself, but as for your pick in McDonald and Thompson, what is it?
I'm going to take Rory, despite having talked about all of Stephen Thompson's improvements. I I just like Rory's game overall. I like the extra motivation of going into free agency. I think that he is an extraordinarily well-prepared fighter, and I also like the fact that from a coaching perspective, Zahabi is so familiar with Stephen Thompson's game. He's worked with him before. He knows Stephen Thompson in and out. I think he has a good sense for what Thompson is going to try to do to McDonald and for how they're going to want to counter it. Thompson's biggest asset is his length, and that's not an advantage that he's going to have against Rory McDonald. I think McDonald's jab is going to be able to take away a lot of what Thompson does really well at range in terms of controlling space and distance. So that's my pick. I don't think it's an easy fight. I think it goes all 5 rounds, but I like McDonald by decision.
All right. Well, then, segue question would be, Peter, is it going to be as bloody as the fight we saw with him and Lawler?
I think we're going to get a fight closer to what he did to Natural Born Thriller out in Vancouver.
I'll take either one of those fights. I would be happy with either performance. That would be fun either way. So I'm looking forward to an incredible fight. You're getting to cover an incredible card for the Wrestling Observer. And speaking of coverage, Patrick, why don't you tell everybody all the places? I plugged them at the beginning, but you can plug them here at the end.
You can find my work regularly on Bleacher Report 2-3 times a week, either collaborating with my colleagues on articles or writing my own stuff. Every UFC card, I have an in-depth technical preview with full analysis of each and every fighter. You can find the Heavy Hands podcast on BloodyElbow.com every Wednesday, also available for download on iTunes. And every Thursday, you can find my technical analysis columns in the Washington Post, now complete with GIFs because I got permission to use them from the UFC. So that's where you can find me at Twitter on Twitter at Patrick_Wyman.
Excellent. And just another cheap plug for the Twitter here, because right at the top pinned is the latest column where you and Jonathan Snowden break down Michael Bisping's upset. So everybody should go check out that. I actually invited Jonathan to be on and he couldn't make it tonight. So my hat's off to him. I love his work. I love what he does. I love what you do, Patrick. So thanks for being on our show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. My pleasure chatting with you guys.
Yep. Let's do it again sometime soon. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Patrick Wyman right here on Glove Up or Shut Up. Peter, another excellent interview and conversation on our show.
Absolutely. We always bring the big guests here, and Patrick is just the latest and greatest one we've got.
So Patrick had to run because we only had a half hour tonight. We actually went a little longer than I thought we would, but I'm glad he stuck around for a few extra minutes. But we didn't get to run down the rest of the Ottawa card, so why don't you and I go ahead and do that here?
Well, I thought we were going to do that next week, though. We got some news to get to first, but
yeah, we can hold off. Although you're going to be kind of busy next week, so that's why I was going to give you the chance right here. If you're too busy next week with all your assignments,
we'll see. We'll wait till next week for that. But I do want to talk about one fight that is piquing my interest here, and that is history will be made here in Ottawa from a UFC perspective, as it's going to have the first ever women's flyweight fight in UFC.
That's right. Well, I'll let you get into a little more depth about that.
Well, it's sort of like the UFC when they went down in weight class. I mean, you got Valerie Letourneau and Joanne Calderwood, two great fighters, now fighting at women's flyweight, and I think it will just allow them to shine more, so to speak. And this is a trial basis by UFC. If this fight is exciting and the UFC sees a need for this weight class, we might have a third weight class for the women in the UFC.
I think so, but I'll say what I've said before about this topic. It's very hard to fill out 3 weight divisions in UFC right now.
It is.
When you got a lot of women that are going to look at 115 and say, well, at flyweight I can drop down to that and be bigger than everybody else, or they're going to look up to bantamweight and say, well, I'm already cutting to flyweight. It wouldn't be too hard to get up there and compete with those bantamweights.
I think it gives them more options, to be honest, because you might have a lot more fighters going from A to B and B to A. It might open up parity. It might open up some very intriguing matchups down the road as well.
I think so too, but just stocking a whole division and coming up with 15 women to rank, that, I just see that as a very formidable challenge. I hope it pans out for them. I would like to see it in the future, but my confidence in it is not high right now, especially when you've got Bellator trying to cherry pick whatever women they can to build a flyweight and a featherweight division of their own. And you've got Invicta, which needs to have a few divisions left and not just give all of their fighters to UFC. So it's going to be a difficult challenge. I can't put it any other way than that.
All right. Well, let's move on, Stevie. We got lots of news to get to, and we didn't get a chance to talk to Patrick about it, but I'm going to do a really good impression here on the return of Brock Lesnar.
That's right. We didn't even get a chance to get too deep into that because we were talking about the controversy that the news kicked off and not the news itself. But as we found out on ESPN on Monday morning, his opponent will be Mark Hunt. So what do you think of that matchup for UFC 200 and the fact that he's coming back to UFC?
This is the problem I have. I mean, Mark Hunt is, he's top 5 right now?
Let's see exactly where he is in the rankings since I still have that tab open. He is number 8 right now in the heavyweight division.
So, if he beats Brock Lesnar, technically a fighter who's not ranked, does it really help him or hurt him? If he gets beat by Lesnar, does Hunt fall down in the rankings? Maybe he gets overpassed by Barnett, maybe Nelson. I mean, from a UFC standpoint, I see what they're trying to do. They're trying to get even more buys, and man, did the WWE ever go into spin control after the announcement was made, though?
Well, I don't think there's too much spin to be had here. It's just a one-off deal. It's literally, we're letting you do this one time, but you're still under contract to us. And by Brock Lesnar's own account, in his interview about it, he went to Vince McMahon and said, you're going to let me do this, and I'm going to arm wrestle you for the right to do this, and if I win, I get it. And Vince was like, sure, why not? And, Vince is a gambler, and he took the match, and he lost the arm wrestling contest, so he had to let Brock do it.
Please tell me there's video footage of this.
I don't think there's any video footage. I think this was behind closed doors. And if it didn't happen, it's a really good story anyway.
If it didn't get recorded, did it ever happen?
That's what I'm saying. We don't know for sure, but like I said, if it did happen, I believe it, because Vince is a gambler at times, and if not, it sure is a fun way to build up this idea of him returning for one fight only. But they did have an open slot. They did have a spot to fill on the UFC 200 card, and this fills it out pretty nicely. But it is a very big risk for Brock Lesnar right now. You talked about the risk to Hunt, because if he wins, he's beating an unranked opponent, and if he loses, he could drop down a few spots and be out of contention. But for Lesnar, it's an even bigger risk because he hasn't fought since he lost to Alistair Overeem. He's been away from the game for a while now. We don't know what he's going to be like at this point, especially after diverticulitis surgery. And we all suspected that maybe that's why he went back to pro wrestling, because he couldn't put in the grueling kind of effort to be a top MMA athlete, and pro wrestling would be a little easier on him. Well, he doesn't pro wrestle like it's any easier on him. He still suplexes and throws people around like nobody's business inside the WWE ring. So maybe he thinks he can do that to Mark Hunt as well. But Mark Hunt has the power of the punch, as William Regal would say, if we're going to bring it into pro wrestling parlance here. So he's got to look out for that, because Mark Hunt, even with his just barely over 500 record, the reason he's number 8 in the heavyweight division right now is because with that one punch he can land, he's knocked out a lot of people.
And for those who haven't seen it, go search out the UFC 200 commercial.
Yeah, well, just for the last 5 seconds alone, that's what you really need to see out of the whole commercial.
I'm surprised they went to ESPN on Monday morning to find out who the opponent was.
Well, I think that goes to this whole controlling the flow of information issue. I think all along UFC had this plan, run the commercial, get people excited, promote it being on ESPN, and then have ESPN break the story. They had a narrative with the way they wanted to tell this.
Now, when the odds first came out for this fight, Stevie, Brock was the favorite. It's now changed, and Brock Lesnar is the underdog.
Yeah, that was the initial hype of Brock Lesnar returning that I think had a lot of people talking positively in the short term, but they're also realizing as more time goes by that this is a guy that's been out of mixed martial arts for a few years, more than a few years, and going against a guy who has been active and who has done quite well for himself with his activity over that time. I mean, it's not like Mark Hunt is coming in here being a tomato can for Brock Lesnar in any way, shape, or form, other than the fact that he lost the title fight and, other than the fact that, like I said, he's just barely over 500 overall, but the guys that he beat, like when he went on his 4-fight win streak, Czech Congo, Ben Rothwell, Stefan Struve, all quality guys, and then he lost to JDS, but that was a great fight that went 3 rounds, and it took JDS catching him with a spinning hook kick And Hunt is an incredibly hard guy to finish, so for JDS to knock him out was something really special. And then, again, the guys that he's lost to are the cream of the crop as far as the division goes, Stipe Miocic and Fabricio Verdum. But when it comes to his last two fights that are leading into this fight, he's got two knockouts where he barely took any damage. First round finishes of Bigfoot Silva and Frank Mears, so it's not like Mark Hunt is going to come in with injuries or having taken a whole bunch of bad shots in recent fights. He's coming in fresh as a daisy here. He should be considered a very, maybe not a very strong favorite, but a favorite, I would say.
Yeah, I think the odds definitely will change now and then, but we've got to move on. We've got lots of news to get to, including a couple of interesting fight announcements. Douglas Lima will replace Josh Koscheck in the Koscheck Daily fight at Bellator 158.
This is a very confusing one for me personally. I was sent the link to the news that broke about it. I was asked to write it up. I dutifully did my job, but not before I emailed multiple people at Bellator asking for a confirmation on this story. Doing my due diligence, just like any other reporter that we would have been talking about earlier on this show, I didn't want to report something that I couldn't get verified from a couple of different sources, and nobody at Bellator got back to me. Now, that's probably excusable in this case because the whole Kimbo Slice thing just occurred on Monday night. Maybe they're all really, really busy right now running around trying to figure out what to do about this Bellator card in London because they just lost their main event as well as losing a very decent man and a very big draw for them. So they probably got their hands full. Maybe they just couldn't get back to me in time, but this news broke with me. I had to write it up. I was instructed to do so. And all this time I'm thinking, what does this mean for next week's show at the Save Mart Center in Fresno? Because he was supposed to be fighting Chidi Njokuani in the co-main event of that card, and nobody is answering that question. I finally just had to give up and write, at press time, the nature of this bout at Bellator 156 is uncertain. That's all I could say. Like, I don't know if that's fight canceled. I don't know if Njokuani gets a new opponent. I don't know if Douglas Lima tries to take two fights back to back and risks losing one and then ends up not being in the co-main event slot where they need him for Bellator 158 in London. Probably not. They probably pull him out of this fight and don't let him take two fights that quick, but it's kind of a mess.
All right. Also, Peter Sabata fighting Nicholas Dalby at UFC Fight Night Hamburg.
I don't have a whole lot to say about that fight because I think you used the word journeyman a little bit earlier, and that kind of describes both of these guys to me.
All right, let's see. UFC Fight Night 81, Matt Mitrione he appealed his loss to the Massachusetts Athletic Commission, and the commission has denied his appeal.
I didn't find that to be the least bit surprising because they generally don't overturn a fight that you lost decisively, and yes, he did get poked in the eyes a bunch of times, and everybody cried foul about it, that his opponent should have been disqualified for that, and, well, it just doesn't work out that way sometimes. You go with what you get in the cage, and he just didn't get that chance, and he wasn't ever going to get that chance.
And I just got one final note here. It looks like Nordine Talib has been pulled off UFC Fight Night 90 due to an injury. UFC is currently looking for an opponent for Alan Jabouin.
Okay, well, we'll wait to see how that plays out, but
that was supposed to happen July 7th in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand Garden Arena.
Right, that's International Fight Week. That's one of the cards for that week.
Like what, three shows that week?
That's generally how they do International Fight Week. They're having, I mean, if you count ancillary shows, there's probably more than 3, but they seem to run a UFC Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night that whole weekend. That's their new modus operandi.
Yeah. All right, well, that's the show this week. Is there anything you want to plug for tomorrow night or Thursday night's AMP?
I think we'll go with plugging the last real man, Silas Young.
The last real man, Silas Young? Really?
Yeah, from Ring of Honor Wrestling is going to be.
Oh, I know. I was like, wow, that's a good get there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Hopefully everybody, including Abby, and I don't mean this in a sexist way, hopefully we all man up so the last real man is not mad at us.
Hi, Abby.
We love you, Abby. Stupid Tana. Stupid hair.
Anyways.
I keep threatening to make a t-shirt for her with that on it, and I just might live up to that.
For Stevie J, I'm Peter H., the Hardcore Canadian. Thanks for listening, and as I always say, never leave it to the judges. Good night, everybody.